talking about utilizing it, you're mentioning anti-stratting, and this is something I've always wanted to talk to someone about because like
Yeah.
I've never had someone experienced in it, and so NIP picked you up specifically for anti-stratting. Were you
I would. I was
used
gonna
to?
say.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, were you used to anti-stratting before being picked up, or was this like a new concept to you, and then you had to like learn it for the job?
To me, it was largely a new concept. Like I had done some anti-stratting before as a player, but it was honestly when I look back, it's it was like pretty basic stuff, and it was attuned for the level of play that it was, right? It could just be as simple as like, oh, they rush B a lot, or they rush B on the first gun round, type of stuff. Like that's easy stuff. But it was definitely like a learned skill for me. I think the biggest thing was just understanding what is valuable to the players and the team, and this kind of comes down to understanding how your team plays too. Fortunately for me, I'd say that fundamentally, I had a pretty good idea of like how they thought about situations and like how they played just from watching the way that they do stuff. So it was kind of it wasn't too hard for me to kind of know what the right reads were. The difficult part was more so how do I do that fast? Because
Mm.
it's without extra programs like today we have noise Gnosis and other stuff like even CS overview. Stuff like this helps anti-stratting a lot, but, if you're kinda going in and just, like, trying to use in-game demo player, that's it's gonna be incredibly tough to do that. I
Yeah.
think I think for me, it was understanding how to use these tools that exist out there as fast as possible and to kinda develop a system around, like, what's actually important in terms of like, even if I look back even let's just say we play against FaZe, in 2 days or 1 day, it's like, how many demos do I look back on them? Like, am I just gonna look at the last 2, the last 3, the last 5, the last 10? Like, which ones actually matter? And after a period of time, I realized that the sweet spot is really, like, 2 to 3 because at tier 1, teams tend to kinda change the way they play or, like, they always evolve and, like, some of their reads are gonna change. So, being able to just kinda spot, like, what that good sample size is was something that I learned. The second thing was kind of trying to understand what I wanted the team to do with my reads.
Mm.
So some analysts that I've heard of or have been in contact with, I'd say a very beginner mistake is to essentially try to give the players all the information because that's a very bad idea. All you'll do is just overload them, and most of the time they're probably just not going to look at it that carefully, and most of your work is just going to go to waste. I think the biggest thing that I learned as well was essentially simplifying it down to like 2, 3, maybe even 4, like very key reads where it's just like, if this happens, you're going to win the round as long as you spot this. I think that was a very key detail for me because when I first started, I think I tried to do too much of like, yo, this is everything. But at the end of the day, what the players really need is just when they see a very certain situation, they need to know how they should react. And these situations will generally be stuff where it's like it's gonna go against their intuition. So for example, it might be something like one read that you might have is on Inferno. Say a team has an A execute where they'd like to smoke Arch, like to smoke Library, and then they like to wrap or something like that. And like they normally like to wrap Arch. Say that's like the default read that you have, but you notice the team that when they throw those smokes, they actually send 3 out halls. That is a very key detail because most of the time when you see those smokes, you're gonna expect an arch wrap, not an A pop or not like A halls pop. So that's when you tell your team like, hey, when you see those smokes, they're actually gonna go for a halls pop. So set up for that instead. Even though that's very like counterintuitive to like how most teams generally play. So I'd say those are the probably the key things where when you're anti-stratting, you want to do things or you want to convey things that are going to help your players or guide your players to the right decision to ensure that they actually make that correct decision because there's so many factors where they might make the wrong one. You want to make sure that what you tell them is going to guide them to the right one.
Yeah. Okay, man. I got so many questions. I feel like I have to write some of this stuff down because I got questions coming up as you're talking.
Yeah.
All right. So Here, the first one I wanted to ask, you mentioned here. I just lost it now. Okay, we'll go to another one. What? So one of them. Yeah, so the first one that came up was actually the system. So you said you developed a system for anti-stratting. Are you able to like reveal this, or is this like some top secret NIP like contract you signed type stuff that you can't discuss?
Okay, so I can't go into like super detail of like what the reads. Actually, no. You know, I'll say this. I can reveal as much as I can through conversation, but I can't. I'm not going to show any documents or
Okay,
anything
okay,
like that.
okay.
So system, at least for me, the system that I had was essentially the two main things. So the first thing was try to figure out try to figure out what if there's anything that indicates what the T's are going to do. So I'd say anti-stratting on T side is more important than CT side. Or like to make that more clear, as in when you're on CT side, you want to know more of what the T's are doing as opposed to vice versa. And that's because when you're a T, it depends on how your team operates. In some cases, you might not care that much about how they like run their CT sides. You might just want to know like, hey, if they have like some weird funky setup that you should be aware of it. But you might not want all the details of like how they rotate and all that stuff. You're mostly going to essentially have a game plan that you built yourself and just adjust it based on these small CT side things. On the T side though, or when you're on CT side and you're fighting their T side, it's for me, at least at tier one, the biggest thing is that you'd have to understand that these teams play against each other a lot. There's essentially a sort of meta that develops between these teams. It may not be like a direct meta, but more so like most teams at this skill level tend to throw these smokes, or they tend to throw these molotovs, or they tend to use these type of timings. And as long as you understand that most teams kind of have that fundamental image already, the key thing is to try to find those teams on certain maps where they don't follow that same structure. Where it's like, let's just say, for example, on Inferno B, say most teams like to throw the spool smoke and the CT smoke and then the flash and they go in, right? But let's just say this is one team where all they do is just throw a flash and then they throw the smoke on the run. That's a pretty key piece of information for your B players to be like, you know, you shouldn't be expecting those smokes to be coming over to tell you when the B pop is coming. It could be happening at any moment. So, maybe have a guy that plays anti flash, or maybe have a guy who's ready with a Molotov out or something like that. These are like the kind of adjustments that you might want to be aware of. And as well, another smaller detail might be like, say on Nuke, everybody throws outside wall smokes, right? But which kinds does the team that you're facing, which ones do they throw the most? Like, do they throw the diagonal ones the most? Do they throw the standard wall ones? And is there anything that those smokes will tell you about where they're going to go? Because there's some teams where they may throw the diagonal wall smoke, but then they don't actually send anybody down secret. And if you identify that, then it means that you don't actually have to rotate a guy down. Vice versa, you might meet a team where they throw those diagonal smokes, and then they actually send like the entire team down. Then for sure you're going to want to have a big rotation. So it's kind of just finding these like mega reads where essentially it's going to just allow your team to make the better decision or the correct decision more often than not. I'd say that's kind of what I distill my system under. Um, it's not that complicated because I personally don't think it's that complicated, but it's just one of those things where as long as that's your goal on what you're doing, I think that's kind of how I operate.
Did you use any tools for this? You mentioned like
So,
two at the start.
yeah. So the first one I'd say is Gnosis. That's probably the best at doing anti-stratting and stuff like that. That being said, that's more. I will say that in today's age, people are using something called Skybox Edge now. I've only had a little bit of experience on how that actually works, but for most teams that are not tier one, you're probably going to be using Gnosis, and that's a great tool for being able to spot like these patterns because it'll show you heat maps of like where players like to go. It'll show you what grenades they throw and stuff like that. And it's very easy to essentially cross reference what happens when somebody throws a smoke. Because there are times where where two people they throw the same nade, but they throw it in different ways. And if you can tell when one player throws that nade versus when another player throws that nade,
Oh,
it'll
yeah.
actually tell you what's about to happen. So the best example I can give is probably overpass B. Everybody throws that B short Molotov, right? Or that B short Molotov typically happens, and it's usually thrown by the B player. But sometimes some teams they have another player throw that B Molotov and they throw it a different way. And typically when that happens, it usually suggests that they're gonna go B or they're gonna do something very special in particular because it just means that it's not their default. So
Yeah.
that's when these like smaller kind of tells, like they're much easier to spot and notice, I'd say.
So yeah, I can imagine like if you're I don't know, like on A site Mirage or something, and you see like a jungle smoke come from like the mid area instead
Hmm.
of like over A main, you're
Yeah,
like, oh, something's up here. Like
yeah, yeah.
that might be obvious even if you didn't do anti-strat work, but like
Hmm.
some shit like that is like what you're talking about, like different directions, like where the smoke is coming
Exactly,
from. Shoot, that's
exactly.
interesting. Yeah,
Yeah,
because
and I
yeah,
mean, I was just gonna say, and it's not just excluded. It's not just smokes. It's also flashes and Molotovs. Like the way somebody throws a flash, or maybe even if they don't throw a flash, like that tells you a lot about what they may or may not do. Even this even goes down, or this even comes down to just like player positioning. I remember, I remember there was a read that I did one time on a team where you know how on most defaults on a Mirage or most defaults on Mirage, there's one player at A, 2 to 3 players mid, and then one player like underpass B, like that area, right? Most of the time, you're expecting that there's only one lurker A. I remember there was one time I found a read where at a certain point in the round, like at 125 or something like that, the A player ends up leaving Palace to go B. And if we could find, or if in the middle of the round, if we could spot when that happens, then we'd be able to know for sure that they're going towards B. Because this is one of those reads where it's like it's one of those reads where you have to take a bit of a risk to find out. Because if you don't take that risk, you're always gonna feel like, oh, it could be A or it could be A. But if you just take the slight little risk of, okay, we're gonna push into Palace at 125. If he's not there, it means it's 100% B. Whereas vice versa, if you don't, then you're just kind of just stuck in this, playing default thing. So it's these kind of reads that like will help teams win rounds out of nowhere. And sometimes like whenever you see top teams where it's like it feels like they make like some kind of weird move or weird over rotation, it could be because of reads like this where somebody on the
yeah,
support staff found something where it's just like this is exactly what's happening.
that's fuck, man, dude. That like I've never thought about like looking into stuff like that when it comes to like calling, and the fact that like you have like people dedicated to do that, like oh, I wonder like that, how different like it's really got to be to like be on those pro teams, like just
Yeah.
like you're doing like quote unquote wrong things if you didn't have the
Hmm.
information, but since you have the information,
Yes.
it's the right thing.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
that was one of the things I was gonna ask is so like I've always heard about conditioning, right? Like how
Hmm.
important conditioning is, and I feel like at the level I play at, like that conditioning can only be done within that one game. So like when you're saying like, oh, this team throws slash smokes and they never go down with it, is the
Hmm.
conditioning at the pro level being done over the course of several games where like we played this team last tournament, we played this team like a week ago in pro league, we played this team and they're like they did this last time. So like are teams like going into like matches like thinking about like how they played against another team and how the other team played against them like recently with that type of conditioning in mind instead of like only the conditioning done in that game itself? Is it like more of a, like a long? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to
Yeah.
ask?
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely think so because whenever you whenever you play against a team after like a short period of time, it could even just be the span of like a weekend or like one tournament after another. There's always like a certain mind game. And I'd say that for the most part, it's like whenever we get into those kind of matches, I've always kind of just thought of it as, okay, this is what they did last time, but be aware that they can change because they know what they've done against us recently. And at the same
Yeah,
time, we're aware of that too, of all the things that we did against them. So I'd say more than anything, this is probably on the IGL to figure out like how he wants to play with this. I'd say for like the coaches and like the support staff, for them to have like direct input on this is a little tough. It kind of depends more on like the IGL, like how they want to call, how they're seeing the game, because ultimately they're the ones that are feeling it, right? Like they're the ones that are like they're the ones that can feel like whether something feels off. So for example, like we may have a read from the previous game And maybe our game plan is to see, is that read still valid? Like maybe
Mm,
we'll just be like, okay, they throw these wall smokes outside all the time. Maybe, first couple gun rounds, we're gonna send a guy like aggressive outside to see, like, hey, is this read still valid? And if it is, then okay, then we realize that this game could be could be being played the same way. But if we see that it's not, then that signals to the rest of the team like, hey, we're playing against a slightly different team this time, so just be more aware of everything. So yeah, definitely mind games, and in terms of like very specific preparation for it, I'd say not a ton, just because I feel if you get to a point where you're just like mind gaming yourself out of like all these different scenarios where you kind of like overthink things, you don't want to get to that point. But I think you just want to be aware of like what you've done and what the other team has done, and just leave it at that, but not build like an entire game plan around it.
okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
The other thing I was gonna ask too is like, I'm assuming the anti-stratting also changes as the levels go up in play. Like,
Hmm.
what are some like valid things that you can do at like a lower level in terms of anti-stratting that you can't do at a high level? So like, I guess like one example, like I would like I never like watched the demo, but like I played against a team and played against them again, and like at the lower level, most people only have like one style of play. Like they're
Yep.
always in like a kill ball, or they're always like split up. And I learned
Hmm.
like, okay, if I can identify like the team how they play, like numbers wise, it's pretty easy to beat them the following game because like we can do things to
Yeah.
counter those specific plays. But like as the levels get up, I'm assuming like you're also counter anti-stratting when you play, so you're like hiding this information. So like what I think I'm getting into two different questions. All right, so the first one is how can you what things can you do at a lower level in terms of anti-stratting that someone can use at like the main to like I don't know, maybe low
Yeah.
advanced that you can't do at the
Hmm.
pro level, and what are some things at the pro level that you do in terms of anti-stratting that you can't do at the lower level?
Okay. So I think, so first question, in terms of at the lower level, I think, so I'm just gonna draw from my own experience in terms of like back when I played at the lower levels. So first thing is people like to run the same pistols a lot. I'd almost say that this is sometimes the case at pro level too.
Oh, really?
So just checking like what pistols people run all the time, that's probably going to be a huge one. I wouldn't be surprised if you already do that.
Do
The
were you
second
in?
thing,
Sorry to cut you off. You just
yeah,
brought back a memory. I think we had like the same CT pistol on Inferno for 2 years. We never did anything else,
yeah,
and it would work.
exactly.
You know?
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing as well about anti-stratting. Like, even though you may know about what the other team is doing, doesn't mean you can stop it. But
Yeah.
that being said, that's just a fact for some teams where they run the same pistols. So that's probably the first thing. Second thing at a lower level is that I'm back then, I imagine there were a lot of teams that had like very set rounds where they didn't do very much to kind of condition the fact that they're doing those set rounds. I'd almost just say like I'd almost just say, if you're at a lower level and you actually want to anti-strat, just load in like their past 3 demos or whatever, and just look for every round that's not a default. Like every
Mm.
round that looks like it's something unique. Note all those down. If they do them in at least 2 of those games, like 2 separate games, then like that's something where you should just be like, okay, we should expect this strat in our game coming up.
That
So
yeah.
that's another one.
To comment on that, that's really interesting because I think I picked up on that like without anti-stratting, but like just in the game, where like
Hmm.
I don't know, like I'm the B player in Inferno, and like let's say they always molly car every round, and then one round they throw a half wall smoke. I'm like,
Yeah.
these fuckers they're gonna abs pop, dude. Like this is so obvious. They've never thrown
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
smoke before. They're trying to buy time.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
interesting you say that. So I think I picked up on that intuitively, but I'm assuming
Hmm.
you could find way more if you were to watch a demo like you're saying
Yeah.
of like
Yeah.
just a random change of pace that they
Hmm.
never set up for. You
Yeah.
can easily counter that.
I'd say almost any of those are probably the easiest ones. Like anything where it's just like it's not their default. Like it'd be so easy to spot in a demo, I'd say. So pistol rounds, I said. Um, Unique gun rounds. I think the third one might be a bit more. Um, I wouldn't expect a lower team to necessarily do this, but like an easy one would just be, how do they fight for the most important part of the map? So, for example, Infernal Banana or Vertigo A ramp, like what smokes do they use? What mollies do they use? Because if you can figure out when they're fighting it versus when they're not, like that's just easy at that point.
Yeah.
Like, because then you'll see that's like, oh, when they throw like all these flashes and the smoke with the Molotov, like, oh, they're definitely fighting it. How you decide to react off of that's up to you. But just being able to see like when they do that stuff and how they do it, I think reveals a lot about how like where the round is going essentially. So I'd probably say those are essentially the easiest ones. I think another one that's probably pretty helpful that's used at the pro level as well is just very simple, just who plays what position. I know back in my day, I definitely didn't do that, and it probably would have helped a lot. So even just like a quick, you know, whoever the IGL is of the lower level team, just go through the demos very quickly and just see like who's their B player, who's their rotate player, who's the A rotate, like who's their anchors. Because as soon as you kind of know like who those are, like you'll be able to get so much more space than than you'll have otherwise. Because otherwise, if you don't have that information, you're always kind of guessing whenever you're pushing into
Yeah.
a bomb site as to whether it's that's the second player or the first player or the third player or whatever. If you know who's playing which site and where they're supposed to be, that helps a lot as well.
Yeah, I've never thought to do that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, like, if you're going into like a site and you kill a B player that's normally not there, you're like, oh shit, they probably have
Yeah, yeah,
information. Or that it's
exactly.
like an anti-eco. You're like, oh, they're probably stacked. Like
Yeah.
that's crazy. Yeah, I don't know how I never thought to do that. That makes a lot of sense.
Don't worry, I didn't think of doing that back then either. But
Yeah.
that the player position one is probably like it's the easiest one that all the pro teams do. I think. Like I'd say even if you're tier two, like just knowing where people play, it helps so much.
Okay. And then what's the vice versa of that then? So like, what are some things that you do at the pro level that you just can't do at the lower level in terms of like anti-stratting?
So I'd say at tier one, the biggest difference is that at tier one, like, and I'm talking about where the phases, vitalities, like those type of teams play, is that it's hard to anti-strat them because the way they play is so concealed at times where it's hard to know like what the tells are and like the reads are just so much harder. And as well, the big thing is because they know they're getting anti-stratted. That's the
Yeah.
difference. They know they're getting anti-stratted. So in a way, they're kind of crafting the way they play to be a little bit less readable because there are definitely teams at the tier two, tier one level who are like kind of transitioning where these tier two teams, because they play so many officials and because like, you know, the structure isn't as developed when it comes to the anti-strat meta, um, it's like they're used to not getting anti-stratted. And then as soon as they go to tier one, you know, maybe they have like one, you know, big tournament or something like that. But then afterwards, they kind of fizzle out because teams know how to anti-strat them and they're not used to getting anti-stratted themselves. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing where it's like it's a lot harder to anti-strat at tier one. And I'd say a good portion of my reads on those type of teams, I'd say are reads that they are not even aware of themselves. You know, it might be stuff like they never throw a flash when they go up mid on Inferno, and when they don't do that, it basically signals that they're gonna go, you know, B or A or whatever. You know, it's these like very very small things, or maybe even something like the guy always extinguishes the Molotov at banana. And when he does that, it means that like there's two or three guys behind him. It's like these very small details at tier one that you know I'd say are you know that you can actually do something with. Whereas like the tier two teams, they haven't necessarily thought like this far. Like I know there's definitely some teams where you know they're on the rise, and it's like for example on Nuke, it's like they have three different types of smoke walls, and like every single smoke wall they have, like it always means one particular thing. Those type of teams do exist in tier 2, and they're, like, the easiest to anti-strat.
Mm.
And, I'll say this is one piece of advice when it comes to anti-stratting that I got from Device. I'm not afraid to say it, but the big thing for him was when you play against those tier 2 teams as a tier 1 team, you should always anti-strat the hell out of them because they're not used to getting anti-stratted, and as soon as you anti-strat them, like, in the middle of the game, they're not gonna know how to adapt because they've never
Yeah.
felt that way before. So I'd say that's probably the biggest difference between tier 1 and tier 2. The tier 1 teams know they're getting anti-stratted and they know how to handle it.
Yeah, you probably like totally throw them off their game. They're like, "Oh shit, I don't know what
Yeah,
what they know about us
exactly.
anymore. I don't want to call this no more." Like,